Get my talk called up here. Whoop. Reviews. All right. Okay. Well, thank you. I appreciate the opportunity to come here tonight and talk about some of the wolf work that I've been doing in and around the Fond du Lac Reservation. The Ojibwe word for wolf is maingan or mainganan if there's more than one wolf. This is the same gray wolf or timber wolf, same animal. Yeah, and so we'll jump right into it. So why do we study wolves? Generally to learn more about them and to help us live with them better, understand them better, to understand how our own activities impact wolves, to answer questions such as how many wolves are there, how many pups do they have, where do they go, and what happens to them. And for these basic kinds of reasons are why I undertook this research for the Fond du Lac Band. The wolf has a particular place in Ojibwe culture. They are part of the Ojibwe creation story. In the beginning, the creator took the original wolf and the original man and had them walk the earth together and give names to the various plants and animals. And then afterwards, according to the Ojibwe stories, the creator put them on separate paths, but said that your fates will always be intertwined, and what happens to one will happen to the other. And many tribal members see parallels today in terms of what happened to Native Americans and their culture and wolves, a history of persecution and diminishment over time, followed by recovery and redemption. And as many band members see the parallels between their history and that of wolves in this country. In addition to being part of the creation story, the wolf is also a clan symbol. Members of the wolf clan are charged with defending their people from enemies. There's a really good book out by a Fond du Lac Band member, Thomas Peacock, called The Wolf's Trail. It's a fictional account of a fictional account, but a history of the Ojibwe and the Fond du Lac Band in particular, as seen and told by a wolf pack resident on the Fond du Lac Reservation. Very enjoyable read, and I can recommend it if you have the opportunity. So if we go back to 200 years ago and what would eventually become Minnesota, wolves were found from one end of the state to the other, in the boreal forest in the north, in the big woods in the central, and in the prairies of the south and west. By the 1930s, wolves had been extirpated from almost all of the state except for the far northern forests. And that was basically the last remaining wolf range in the lower 48 states until relatively recently. And I think what saved wolves in Minnesota was the fact that those remaining animals were surviving in a forested area with very little livestock for conflicts, fairly remote and inaccessible, and also a shared border with Canada and Canadian wolves to help supplement the population. Beginning in the early 1970s with protection under the Endangered Species Act, as well as I think even before that, cessation of things like paying bounties for wolves or the end of using poison and things like that, wolves begin to recover their numbers with this protection. In addition, their major prey species, moose, deer, beaver, also begin to recover their populations. And between the two, wolves begin to expand their range in Minnesota until modern times. They've reoccupied about 40% of the state. So we'll switch gears a little bit and talk about a typical Minnesota wolf pack. And this is a Minnesota wolf pack, not those giant Yellowstone wolf packs that you see on the nature specials. Our wolf packs in Minnesota are much smaller and generally only have one breeding pair, unlike some of the packs in Yellowstone, which are 20 or even more animals from time to time. And on a number of occasions, they've documented more than one breeding pair. In Minnesota, typically just one breeding pair. In fact, I've never heard of a case otherwise. These would popularly be known as the alpha wolves, the male and female. Underneath them might be a 1 or 2 year old offspring, or perhaps an unrelated adult that they've adopted into the pack. And then the remainder of the pack would consist of their puppies from the previous spring, about 10 months old by midwinter. Our typical midwinter Minnesota wolf packs are 4 to 5 animals in size. That's the average. Of course, there are some packs that are quite a bit bigger than that. There's also a lot of wolf packs in Minnesota that consist of just the breeding pair. In addition to the pack animals, of course, there's always dispersing or lone wolves circulating in the population. Those might be a mix of those 10-month-old pups that are striking out on their own, or older wolves that have remained with the pack for a while longer and have just started to disperse. How big are wolves is a question I commonly get. They're not as big as most people think they are. I think, they're a long-legged animal with a shaggy coat, and I think people quite commonly overestimate how big they are. The adult females that I've handled range from 50 to 75 pounds. When she's nursing a litter of pups in the spring, she's a lot closer to 50 pounds than to 75 pounds. Adult males in the range of 70 to 100 pounds. The biggest wolf that I know about from Minnesota that I believe was weighed at 125 pounds, and the biologist that weighed him said he also had a belly full of deer meat. So again, our wolves, max out at around 100 pounds, a little bit smaller than say wolves in Yellowstone Park. Colors of wolves in Minnesota. The vast majority of animals in Minnesota are kind of that typical gray color, like this wolf on the left, but there's a lot of shades of gray, and some animals might tend more towards red, like this animal on the right. Black wolves are fairly rare in Minnesota. They're out there. There's a couple living on the Fond du Lac Reservation. But probably less than 5% of the population, although those numbers may be increasing. The black color phase is much more common in Western wolf populations. Interestingly, that black gene, or the gene for that black coat, actually comes from a domestic dog, and according to geneticists, approximately 7,000 years ago in Western Canada, a gray wolf bred with a black dog and produced the black color coat that we see in wolves. White wolves are very rare in Minnesota. I've only heard of a couple cases. I think more commonly what you get are older gray wolves who, like a lot of our dogs, when they get old, their coat starts to show a lot more gray and a lot more white. So there are some true white wolves out there like this one, but very uncommon. So what do wolves eat? A across Minnesota, their bread and butter prey animal is white-tailed deer. When white-tailed deer numbers are doing well, wolves are doing well. Probably the second biggest prey item for wolves is beaver, particularly, of course, during the open water season. They're pretty unavailable to wolves during the winter when they're under the ice, but the rest of the year they're available to wolves. And some wolves in some packs really get proficient at hunting beaver. They can't get them in the water. They have to wait for beaver to come out of the water and start collecting tree branches and stuff for their lodges or for food. And then they try to ambush them on the shore. Where moose and wolves overlap in Minnesota, moose, of course, are an important prey item. Smaller animals like rabbits, mice, grouse certainly are all possible prey items for wolves, but wolves cannot make a living on these smaller animals. They need the big prey, deer, moose, beaver, to get by. These smaller animals are more of a snack when they can get them. And of course, it is also possible to consider livestock as a prey. It's not a typical prey animal in Minnesota, but it does happen pretty regularly. And most of the conflicts between wolves and livestock are centered on beef cattle, and in particular, beef calves are the most common livestock killed by wolves in Minnesota. How old do wolves get? So this is some data that was collected from the hunting season that Minnesota had in 2012. Hunters and trappers that took wolves were required to turn in a tooth for aging. It's probably a little biased towards younger animals. They tend to be more susceptible to hunting and trapping. But in talking to other wolf biologists, it probably fairly well shows the age distribution of wolves in Minnesota, in that we have very few wolves over about the age of 6, and certainly not very many at all that make it into double digits. And it's probably not surprising if you think about it. If you think about your dog, probably by the time they're 10, 11, 12, they're slowing down, and yet they get regular health care and regular meals. And that's, of course, not possible for a wild wolf. So it's hard to find an old wolf, or at least more than about 6 years old. So how do we catch wolves for studying them? Or the first thing we have to do when we're studying them, at least the way we are, is to catch them. Most of the wolves we catch are with foothold traps. They have a kind of a hard rubber jaw. They don't have teeth the way Hollywood would portray these traps. But a hard rubber jaw to grab hold of the wolf, minimize injury. It also has a drag on there and a spring. So when the wolf gets caught, it can pull the trap out of the ground and drag it back into the trees to get off the road or trail and under the shade. And typically we're burying these along the sides of a forest road or trail, someplace where we're finding wolf sign and know that they're traveling back and forth. Kind of hide it there, put something stinky in a hole right behind it, and wait for a wolf to come along and step in it. The other way we catch wolves during the winter time, we can't use foothold traps because there's a risk of freezing a wolf's foot. So we switch to using snares. We throw out a bait first, usually a roadkill deer, and wait for the wolves to find it. And then as they're coming back and forth to feed, they're building trails through the snow, and they're like us. If somebody breaks trail through the deep snow, they're going to keep walking in it. They don't want to, create more work for themselves than they have to. So once they have a trail laid down, we'll anchor a snare down through the frost, and then basically hang the wire over their trail at head height on a wolf. and wait for them to walk through and knock it loose around their head. Unlike kill snares, the snares we're using have a stop on that wire, so it snugs down, but it doesn't, and it holds the wolf, but it doesn't choke the wolf. Once we have a wolf captured, our next step is to sedate it. Usually this is a two-person operation. Get one person, like John here on the right, to distract the business end of the wolf, and then Matt or somebody else comes around to on the other side and sticks a syringe into the wolf's rump with the tranquilizer that we give it. Once the wolf is down, we carry it back to our processing site. Usually we have wolves down for 45 minutes to an hour. We collect a number of measurements. We ear tag them, microchip them, get an estimate of age just from their teeth wear, a number of other things that we do with wolves. And then, of course, the most important part for my study is to attach the tracking collar on them. We're using GPS collars that communicate with a satellite to send me those locations that are recorded by the collar. The collars we're using cost about $2,500 a piece. They weigh about 1.5 pounds. Here's on top of the collar is the GPS receiver and the satellite transmitter. Then there's some cables buried inside the leather band here. And then this lower part contains the battery pack and the data storage area. And then over here on the left is the blow-off unit, which has its own power source and a timer on it, which the way I have them programmed, after 3 years, it's designed to set off a charge so that the collar breaks apart and drops off the wolf, and the wolf isn't permanently collared. And then, of course, these collars, in addition to having a satellite transmitter, also carry a radio beacon that we can pick up with a receiver, and every collar has its unique radio frequency so we can tell which wolf we're listening to. And then after we reverse the wolf and they're up and away, this is the sort of information we're getting back to them. All of these red points here are wolf locations over time. And said our collars are designed to last for about 2.5 to 3 years and give us several locations a day, depending on how we program them, on where the wolf is going. We rarely see the wolves that we catch again after we release them, unless they happen to walk in front of somebody's trail camera. And so again, this is continuing with the kind of data that I look to collect, is determining where they go and where are the territories of the various wolf packs that are using the reservation, and trying to outline, where their usual haunts are and where they go. And right now it looks like we have this past winter we have 5 packs, 4 of which we have a collar in. This Nygaard pack up here in the north. We know they're there, but I haven't been able to catch one and collar it. But the other packs, we all have 1 or more wolves wearing a collar in to help us show us where their territories are. And it's kind of cool. You zoom in on some of these locations. This is a collar we have on the Otter Creek breeding male in the Otter Creek pack. The core of his territory is the Cloquet Forestry Center, which is over here on the left side of the screen. But as you can see, he quite regularly is crossing the infield of the Cloquet Airport. I think usually at night. I also think he may be hunting for mice, rabbits, and the mowed grass around the airport, but he's quite commonly back and forth there. He's poked around the edges of the Black Bear Golf Course a couple of times. And this past winter particularly, he's gotten down into the Pine Valley ski area over here. This is Interstate 35 here, Highway 33 running north into Cloquet. If you're familiar with Cloquet, the super one is right about here. And the hockey shelter is right in here. So yeah, they are interestingly quite closer to us than we sometimes realize. And I think it's mostly at night and, mostly staying back in the woods. But it's really interesting to see how commonly they're moving around close by. The other thing that we use our collars for is to help us locate wolf dens. Wolves are giving birth or have had pups within the last couple weeks. Typically, it's late March to late April when they're giving birth. What I'm looking for, and this is locations from the breeding females collar with the headquarters pack. Here's where she had her pups last year. You can see the pups are born blind and nearly naked, and she has to stick with them almost constantly to nurse and care for them. You can see her locations are clustered really tightly here. And then later she moved her pups over to here. By now they're getting older, and so she doesn't have to stick with them quite as much, just coming back at intervals to nurse them. Then she moved them again over to here, and you can see her locations are gradually spacing apart. She's wandering around more, leaving them for longer and longer periods. But this is another thing that these satellite collars help us with, is determining where their dens are and when they had their pups. We have found with the den work that we've done that the most common den that we come across is probably what you would visualize. It's a hole in the ground. I suspect wolves are not digging these holes themselves. I think other animals, badgers, woodchucks, fox, maybe bear, are initiating these holes, and then eventually wolves find them. They may enlarge them a bit, but I think the primary digging is started by other animals. But this is the most common kind of den that we find for wolves. However, we see a lot of these as well, above ground dens, brush piles, or often a tipped over tree, and mom will just curl up underneath the root wad or underneath the bole of the tree where it's tipped over, and that works well enough for her. More than once, I've seen dens that were as simple as this. It's just she went underneath some low-hanging conifer branches and made a scrape in the ground, and 2 years ago this wolf gave birth to 5 pups in this spot. And that worked well enough for her. There was still snow on the ground then, but she pulled it off, and we see this fairly regularly. We also have determined that wolves are quite willing to use the junk that we leave in the woods if it makes a nice den. This is an old propane tank that was repurposed by somebody as a maple syrup evaporator. And they cut a hole here to put their wood in to boil away the sap. Well, when they quit using it, they just flipped it upside down and walked away. Well, Mama Wolf found it, and she crawled in there and gave birth to 9 pups, and nice and dry, a good steel roof on it, and worked well for her. So we typically do our den work when the pups are about 4 weeks old. Partly because they get much older than that and they get too fast for us to catch. So at that 4 weeks old, they're still easy enough to handle. They're still sticking very close to the den, and yet they're not helpless at this point either. And yes, they do mostly have blue eyes at this point. The wolf pups get the same treatment the adults get, except they don't get sedated. They get measured, weighed, microchipped. We're counting noses to see how many pups there are. And we've seen a range of anywhere from 3 to 9 pups in a litter. I'd say commonly around 6. But yeah, so we take a number of measurements. We microchip pups in case we handle them later as an adult. And then when we're done, we stick them back in the den. The last couple of years, I've been working with my colleague at the 1854 Treaty Authority, Morgan Swingen, and Morgan is trying to do some of the same stuff with pups that we're doing with adults, determining pup survival and causes of mortality. And to do that, she's putting these small expandable radio collars on pups. They have slack in the collar. There's a stretchy material to begin with, and then there's slack sewn up in there. So as the pup grows, those pleats break apart and the collar continues to expand. We've had issues with pups chewing each other's collars off. But it is working. We're getting a little better at it, and Morgan is starting to get some information on pup survival and causes of mortality. We put the pups back when we're done, and usually mom is always back within a few hours, and always within 1 or 2 nights, she's got all the pups moved to a different den. And we're always hanging cameras up to see what happens after we leave. And it's very interesting. We pretty routinely get bears coming by to check out wolf dens. We get porcupines coming by, blue jays landing in that dirt there at the entrance hole. Sometimes maybe for dust baths, but I think they're also perhaps looking for ticks and other things in that dirt. But it's pretty neat, and I'm quite certain with some of these animals, the bear, for instance, that they are, making a note that, oh, here's a nice dry hole, and she may come back in the fall and use it herself as a den. We certainly have found porcupines in old wolf dens. So I think we're not seeing very much reuse of dens by wolves. And I think that's just because there's a lot of den possibilities out there for them. And some years the wolves are using them, and some years other animals are using them. We are seeing that wolves in Minnesota are commonly moving their den during the course of the season. We don't always know why, except that one of those movements is due to our disturbance. The rest of the time, we can only speculate. It may be other predators nearby, such as a large bear or perhaps a big bobcat or other wolves in the area, stranger wolves. Although we suspect that commonly it's just that mom decides that she wants a clean den. The pups are there pooping, and they're eating regurgitated food. There's fleas, ticks, other parasites around, and eventually mom decides it's just easier to move house rather than clean house. So what I'm showing here are the various dens that the Dead Fish Pack used. She gave birth to her pups here on the shore of one of our rice lakes, then moved them around over here, then moved them again, and this is about a mile between here. And in this den is where we found her pups that year, and then after we were there, she moved them to another den, and then finally about another mile to the last den that she used that year. What happens to our wolves? Well, a variety of things, mostly human related. Since I've been studying wolves around Fond du Lac, I've only had one wolf that was killed by other wolves. A couple of wolves killed by, one by a car and one hit by a train. And I think so far that cause of mortality is underrepresented. Just based on what I'm anecdotally seeing and finding, there's a lot of wolves that are hit by cars. So I suspect over time, this share of the pie, that pie slice is going to get much bigger. We've had a number of wolves killed, 5 of them, for depredation complaints. Basically, they get into trouble killing livestock, and then the federal or state trapper comes and removes them. And so that's been a big share of mortality. We've had illegal harvest is also another large share. I think it's different kinds of illegal harvest. Certainly, some of it is people deliberately targeting wolves, shooting them during deer season because they don't like them, or somebody knows wolves are around and sets a snare to try and kill them. Other times, I think wolves are accidentally getting killed, getting caught in snares set for other animals such as fox or coyote. Yeah, so it's not intentional, but it's still illegal. And so that's also been a significant share of the mortality. One wolf died from unknown reasons. I'm not sure if it was a bite or hit by a car and got away and died later. It had a bad infection on its back at the base of its tail. And then one wolf that was killed during a legal hunting season, but she had to go all the way up to Canada for that to happen. So dispersal is another thing that we're tracking with our wolves. Not all of the animals we catch stick around. We caught this young female just on the north side of the Fond du Lac Reservation in February, and she was already traveling from somewhere. I don't know where she started from, but she was not a resident Fond du Lac wolf. She kept going up past the Duluth reservoirs, out towards Isabella, then back over towards Ely and around Lake Vermilion, then back and forth across Highway 53 over towards International Falls. Swam back and forth across the Rainy River a couple of times. And so we caught her in February. So now it's April, May by the time she's up here. She headed north finally into Canada, went up to Lake of the Woods. By now it's late May. If I zoom in on her locations around Lake of the Woods, she's actually swimming between islands in Lake of the Woods. Eventually crossed back to the mainland. Looped up towards Dryden, came back down towards Fort Frances, and hooked up with a pack to the north of Fort Frances, and had settled down there until she was killed a few months later during a hunting season. Another wolf dispersal, again, a young female that had started her travels from somewhere. We caught her on the west side of the reservation. She milled around there for a while. Headed over towards the Sandy Flowage and McGregor, dropped south past Mille Lacs, all the way down to Pine City, crossed the interstate down by Pine City, came up again north past Hinckley around Sandstone, milled around there for a while, then went over into Wisconsin. And again, this all happened in just a few months. And for the last 2 years, she's established herself as the breeding female. And this white smear here is just all of her locations. She's established a territory and is the breeding female for a pack just outside of Gordon, Wisconsin. So estimating wolf populations, that's another big part of my job. Generally, we try to do our wolf population counts in midwinter when wolf numbers are at their lowest. When pups are born in the spring, the wolf population is at their highest. And then over the course of the spring, summer, and fall, wolves are dispersing or they're dying. And so the low point, the low ebb of the wolf population is generally midwinter. So we see a pack like this, for instance, in early September. And I think there's 9 wolves in this picture. The collared wolf, the breeding female, is back here. This might be the alpha male here. 9 wolves in this picture. Most of them are pups. There was actually 12 wolves that paraded past the camera here. But this was early September. By midwinter, this pack was down to 5 or 6 animals. The first step in determining wolf population is determine how much wolf range we have in Minnesota. And that's done at intervals by wildlife biologists, foresters, other natural resource workers, just using a combination of collared wolves, and then just also wolf sign that is observed on the landscape. So where in Minnesota do we seem to have resident wolves? And so once we've determined that, the next step using our collared animals is to determine average territory size for wolves. And it varies a little bit from year to year, depending on usually on prey availability. When wolves are eating well, they don't need quite as big a territory. The winter of 2021, average territory size in Minnesota was about 46 square miles for a wolf pack. I think the wolf packs around Fond du Lac generally are smaller than that, more towards the 20 to 30 square mile size. And I think that's because around Fond du Lac and the Duluth area, as compared to other parts of wolf range, we have better prey availability, just a higher density of deer and beaver and things like that. And so wolves don't need quite as big a territory. So within that wolf range, we're looking for average territory size and then extrapolating to see how many territories can fit into Minnesota's wolf range. The next step in the process, again, using our collared animals, is to track down, often with an aircraft, the signal from the collared animal and try to catch the whole pack out in the open so you can get a pack count. This usually takes several tries, even with an airplane. They don't usually all travel together and have the good grace to stand out in the open. But when this is what we're aiming for, is a nice shot of the wolves together out in the open where we can get a good count. At Fond du Lac, I'm often using baited camera traps, again, using a roadkill deer for bait, waiting for the wolves to find it, and then come back with the whole family. This is usually a long process. Wolves don't seem to like to pose for family portraits. Often they're coming in one or two at a time, or some of the wolves are on camera and other wolves are milling around behind. But this is the kind of money shot that we're going for. Here there's 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. And after numerous tries, this is what we determined was the size of the Marshall pack that year. We also use track counts in known wolf territories, is another way we can help estimate the average pack size. And so then we put all this data together. We have square miles of occupied wolf range in Minnesota divided by the average territory size of wolves times the average pack size, and then we throw in a fudge factor for all those single dispersing wolves that are out there on the landscape, and that generates our statewide population estimate. What we've have seen with the estimates, and this method of estimating wolves in Minnesota has been consistent for a number of years now. And now we're doing it. We used to do it at intervals. Now we're trying to do it annually. We probably had a slowly increasing number of wolves, certainly as they've expanded their range. Wolf numbers in recent memory were probably highest in the early to mid 2000s, because that's when we had the most deer on the landscape. We'd had a series of mild winters and deer populations really exploded. And so our highest wolf estimates were at that same time period when we had the highest deer numbers. Since then, deer numbers have declined. Wolf numbers have declined also, perhaps come up a little bit in recent years, but certainly what we've seen is a trend towards a fairly stable wolf population of around 2,500 animals in Minnesota. We are seeing that, again, wolf numbers closely track our estimates of deer density. When deer are doing well, wolves are doing well, and vice versa. And we've certainly seen that trend over time. And I said, I use those same methods to estimate wolves on the Fond du Lac Reservation. This past winter, between trail camera pictures and aerial counts, probably 6 wolves in the Otter Creek pack, 5 wolves in the Gist pack, 4 in the Deadfish, and 7 in the headquarters pack. Two or maybe more, but at least 2 up here in the Nygaard pack. There's not much of a correlation between pack size and territory size, at least where I'm working. I don't know why. Maybe it just depends on prey availability and or the aggressiveness of particular packs. But certainly this past winter, the headquarters pack was the biggest pack that I was following and had the smallest territory. Yeah, so that doesn't always seem to correlate nicely. But this past winter, we had about 24 resident adult wolves using the Fond du Lac Reservation. And like the statewide estimate, that number has been fairly stable over the past few years. One of the other things we're doing with our collared wolves is we've had the opportunity to study how the line 3 and line 4 oil pipeline construction across the Fond du Lac Reservation has impacted our wolf movements. The pipeline crosses about 13 miles of the reservation and impacts the territories of 3 different packs. And we fortuitously, before and during and now largely after this pipeline construction, have had collars on the same animals in all 3 packs to help us determine the impacts of that construction. We're still looking at this data, still doing analysis, but in brief, I think what we're finding is there wasn't a whole lot of impact of construction on wolves, and the impact there was pretty temporary. We're seeing that wolves, while the pipeline, the trench was dug and the pipe was strung across the ground, that the number of times wolves were crossing the right-of-way was greatly reduced, but not entirely eliminated. They found ways to get around it. We didn't find any evidence that wolves moved further away during the construction process. We had 2 packs that denned within a half mile of the pipeline right away, and all 3 packs that we were studying successfully raised 1 or more pup during the construction process. All 3 packs maintained their territories. Nobody abandoned their territory. And we did not document any adult or pup mortality that was related to construction of the pipeline. So that's what I had, if there's questions.
I have a question. The pup number where you raised, you said they raised 1 or more pups. Is that pretty typical?
Well, we're trying to find that out, and that's part of Morgan's study. Where it seems to vary quite a bit. Some litters, the pack is very successful at raising all or almost all of the pups, and some litters, they lose almost all of the pups. I suspect from what we found so far that diseases like parvo play a major role and are responsible for a lot of pup mortality. But we think we've had predation events or possible predation events on some pups. So yeah, it just, related to the pipeline, all of those packs successfully raised at least 1 pup, but that was 1, and at the upper end it was more like 7. So it just varied depending on the pack, and the pup mortality that occurred, we couldn't find any evidence that it was related to pipeline construction.
Sure, thanks.
Yeah.
I think Marcia asked in the chat, are there any black wolves currently?
Yes, Cloquet Forestry Center, the Otter Creek Pack, Gray Father, Black Mother, and she's throwing half or more of the 2 litters she has are black pups. And yeah, so I think this past winter, she still had one of her 2020 pups hanging around. And this is a fairly new pack. I think they only established themselves on the Cloquet Forestry Center in the fall of 2019. And she had her first litter in the spring of 2020. This past winter, she still had a 2020 pup hanging around, and that was black, and at least 2 black pups and 1 gray pup from 2021. Interestingly, some of the work they've done generally, and I think primarily in Yellowstone, the black color phase wolf, they're not as aggressive as gray wolves, but they may have a little more disease resistant than the gray color phase.
So Mike, this is Cindy. I was wondering, dispersal wise, how far does the typical wolf go? Like if you've got these, adjacent packs, are they going, some of them just going to the next pack over and getting established, or are they all going way far away?
The ones that I've caught are going way far away. And we have, we had a pup. It wasn't collared, but we had microchipped it. And then we caught it again when it was 5 months old and were able to ear tag it. And that was just up there where the intersection of Highway 2 and Highway 33 is. That pup wound up getting killed illegally, but all the way down by Mora. So my sense is when they leave home, they're traveling a long distance. But yeah, I don't know if we just don't have enough data, at least in my study, to be able to say if, how far some animals, I'm sure some animals are moving only a short distance, but my sense is more commonly they're traveling quite a ways.
And is that the males and the females? And then,
yeah,
okay.
Males and females. I'm not seeing, I haven't seen yet any inclination for one sex to stick closer to home than the other one.
Okay. And final question would be, as they're going across, adjacent packs, are they under a lot of threat from the wolves in that adjacent pack, or can they travel through pretty easily? Maybe you don't know. I don't know. That might be.
Well, I think it may depend on the sex of the wolf, and it may depend on the pack whose territory they're crossing. Wolves, like people, have personalities, and some of them are much more aggressive than others. And it also, I think, can depend on the time of year. If there are young pups in the den, or if it's the breeding season and she's in heat, there's a lot more hormones in play on both sides, and I think that can lead to a lot more aggression for trespassing wolves. So I guess the short answer is it depends, but my sense is they generally are going to try to avoid contact with resident wolves when they're making these movements.
Thanks, Mike.
Okay, so there's a couple of really good questions in the chat. The first one is from Marcia, and she's asking, are vocalizations usually similar among wolves?
I'm not an expert on wolf vocalizations. I have, I guess I'm not aware of them vocalizing differently the way, say, whales or birds will have different songs. But I guess I'm maybe not the best person to answer that question.
And then Emily asks if scientists know why a wolf's color makes them more or less susceptible to disease. Is it genetics or behavior or both?
I suspect it is not behavior. It is probably a, that black coat comes originally from dogs, and I think it is probably linked with genes that give them more disease resistant, but it's not necessarily, it's not what gives them the disease resistance. It's just linked to that same genetic profile.
Interesting.
Hey, so this is Maya. So I'll get to the question. I recently learned about how foxes hunt and that they've been finding they use the Earth's magnetism and they count and they can have this crazy accuracy. But foxes are seemingly very different from wolves in their patterns on how they hunt. So since you actually have camera footage of wolves kind of in action, like how do wolves differ in their approach to hunting? Is it kind of more like lions where they kind of send out the women and they do all the hard work? Is it, free for all? Do they scavenge more? Because obviously they're not unwilling to eat roadkill, right? So this one you might have a better chance of answering.
Yeah. No, I've certainly seen, setting aside the roadkill that we put in front of our cameras, some of these animals have figured out that patrolling the edges of Highway 2 or Highway 33 or 210 is a good way to pick up a meal. These wolves are not shy about scavenging if they know there's likely to be food there. I recently had just 2 weeks ago, had a wolf whose normal territory was up by Highway 2. She went all the way down to Highway 210 and camped out in the woods for 2 days behind somebody's farm. Well, I knew a member of the family. I asked her, said, so did somebody put a cow carcass out there? Yeah, last January. Wolves smell, the carcass is 3 months old now, and there was still enough smell there and something to attract the wolves down there and enough to keep them there for a whole day. As to differences with foxes, I think fox, obviously they're hunting a much smaller animal than mice and rabbits and squirrels, as opposed to and with fox often birds, as opposed to wolves, which are generally hunting large mammals. I think fox are probably more commonly an ambush kind of predator, short rush, jump on it, kill it, whereas wolves are commonly a chasing animal and will run the prey, with the exception of beaver, which they need to ambush. But with deer and moose and bison and elk, they run the animal for a distance, corner it, and gradually wear it down and drag it down. So it's different hunting styles. With wolves, I think coyotes use a lot of hearing to locate mice underneath the snow. And certainly wolves have good hearing and probably helps them in the hunt. But I think their noses and their legs play a much bigger role in their hunting patterns than with fox.
Do they usually take one large down and then share it with the whole group, or are they just pigs and eat it all themselves?
If their brothers and sisters don't want to get there in time, they're not going to wait for them. No, I mean, that they are commonly hunting as a group, traveling as a group, not always, but commonly. And they're, we can see them on camera. I mean, there's some growling and snapping at each other, but they're sharing. The whole pack is there dining at the same time. And, somebody might drag a leg off so they can eat in peace by themselves. But yeah, it's a sharing thing. And when the pups are in the den and when mom's in there nursing them, it's on the other members of the pack to bring her food, and later as the pups switch to less milk, to bring the pups food as well. And in most cases, they're bolting food down at the kill site, bringing it back and regurgitating it for mom or the pups to eat at the den.
Okay, there's a
Thank
couple more
you.
questions. Sorry, in the chat. Amy says that she's from Wisconsin, she's a wildlife advocate, and is asking, what do you think influences the farm conflicts locally? And are there many non-lethal measures to use to avoid removals by death?
We could do a whole presentation on wolf livestock conflicts. Non-lethal means are being employed more and more to try and deter wolves. There are, in talking to the biologists and trappers that deal with these conflicts most often, there are a lot of farms that are just, because of where they're located, literally at the end of the road next to the woods, they are just regular targets for wolves. And wolves are often taking livestock at times of the year when deer are hard to catch. And so they're hungry, and livestock represent, by comparison, an easy available meal. So a normal year in Minnesota, 100 to 200 wolves are killed because of mostly livestock conflicts. Sometimes it's for killing domestic dogs, or sometimes because they become too habituated to people. They are trying to do more non-lethal deterrence methods. They're generally expensive, and many of them work for a time, but after a while, you see this with coyote decoys to get rid of the geese, right? After a while, the geese get used to the decoys and they don't care anymore. So those bright lights and noises that you might use to deter wolves will work for a while, and maybe it works long enough for the wolves to move on and go away, or sometimes the wolves just get used to it and keep coming back.
And Emily asked if wolves have been recorded eating berries and fish as well in Minnesota.
Yes, they've been recorded eating berries and fish. In fact, I watched a 3-month-old wolf pup one time, wandered off away from its brothers and sisters looking for a meal, found a pile of fish carcasses. Band member had been netting on Mille Lacs and had cleaned their walleye and taken the carcasses out in the woods and dumped them. And those fish carcasses had been there for about a month. And that pup thought he had died and gone to heaven. He just laid down there chewing on those nasty old fish carcasses. So yes, they will eat. And Voyagers Park has done a nice job of, or the Voyagers Wolf Project has done a nice job of videoing wolves hunting and taking fish. I'm sure it happens at Fond du Lac. We've had wolves that have learned to take beavers out of beaver traps. And yeah, they'll cruise our beaver traps in the spring, and if they find a dead beaver, they'll just take the beaver. Yeah, berries, I'm sure, insects from time to time, mice. I found grouse feathers next to wolf dens, so a variety of things. Yeah.
Okay, so last question is, do coyotes and wolves coexist?
Well, they coexist, but they're not generally good buddies. Wolves will often kill coyotes if they catch them. And I think it's just because if you look at the spectrum, fox, coyotes, wolves, coyotes are close enough to wolves in size and prey interests and things like that, that wolves probably see coyotes as a competitor. So if they had been known to catch and kill coyotes. Wolves, by contrast, usually leave fox alone. Fox are often scavenging at wolf kills. But coyotes and fox don't get along very well, and coyotes will often kill red fox. Again, I think that's because, you know, these two predators are close enough in size and prey overlap. But wolves and fox, there's enough difference that wolves don't care much. Certainly coyotes can coexist where wolves are, excuse me, but they have to, they may have to hang a little closer to people if we're around. Than wolves might, and they you know, traveling in different places or at different times than when the wolves are there, you know, looking over their shoulder to make sure the wolves aren't close. We've certainly seen wolves visiting a bait site, and after the wolves leave, you know, the next day, the next night, the coyotes will come in and feed too, but we certainly don't see them there together.
Awesome. Well, thank you guys so much for coming, and thank you so much, Mike, for that awesome presentation. It was really interesting and really informative, and a lot of people in the chat are also thanking you as well for that great presentation.
Thank you.
Our next program is actually going to be May 12th at 7 p.m. and it's going to be Beavers Living in Harmony with Nature's Eco-Engineers, and that's going to be with Skip Lyle and Connie Gunderson. So if that's something that you're interested in, definitely email me at valerie@wildwoodsrehab.org. But again, thank you everyone so much for coming, and thank you, Mike, for that great presentation.
Thank you very much. You guys everyone have a good evening.